Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 40 of Series 7. The question for today is, must we create values in order to address the potentialities of life? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 5. In these workshops, I'm talking about human existence at its most fundamental level as consciousness. I then ask, what can we do with the phenomenon of consciousness that is essentially what we are? I answer with a principle of value as an affirmation of value leading to a sufficiency of value. But as this answer implies, there are many different values. Sartre tells us that they spring up like partridges, and values often contradict each other or fail to resolve ethical issues as we might have hoped. The problem for ethics is finding an ethical normativity that can cope with the complexities and diversities of life, or more radically, preventing the ethical inversion posed by Sartre's good be my evil, evil be my good. Yet questions of value are in no way restricted to ethics, which often monopolises the subject. Values are also central to meaning, purpose and aesthetics, as well as to knowledge and understanding. Values are thereby also about how we think, perceive, feel and comport ourselves. The question then arises of how to find some consistency, coherence, normativity or objectivity in our values. And if the required values aren't found in existing sources, we might need to invent or create such values. This is a significant distinction sometimes made, as here, between inventing and creating values. That is, we might not create values out of nothing, but invent values from preconditions. My position is one of inventing values out of the pre-existing conditions of consciousness, selection and choice. And on this basis, I argue for normative values and against objective and universal values. I trust that these differences will become clearer in the course of this discussion. The traditional view is that ethical values are objective, given by God, or exist independently, perhaps in the world. But the religious case is challenged by skepticism about God's existence and the inflexibility of divine law. And the view that objective ethical values exist in the world is challenged by philosophy. We will have a look at some of these arguments shortly. But arguments for the objectivity of values can include the idea that moral values aren't created but discovered. For example, Nikolai Hartmann believed in independent or potential values created by God, waiting to be adopted. But without God, anything could be a potential value if needed at a later time. Yet Kant takes an intermediate position that we legislate our own values that are determined by reason. But the derivation of values from reason is widely challenged by such as Hume's is-ought distinction. Yet there are other religious thinkers who hold that values are objective and therefore can't be created. For example, Iris Murdoch believes that moral values aren't created by choices but by engagement with reality. And William Lane Craig holds that there is no basis for objective morals other than God. Yet these views depend on God in various ways to sustain their existence. That is, God either justifies a realist conception of the world or justifies values directly. But there are also some secular philosophers who think that there are, or should be, objective values. Susan Wolf, for example, holds that ethical values need to be objective and part of the fabric of the world. Ronald Dworkin holds the odd view that there is only one objectively right answer to ethical questions. And Robert Nozick believes that, I quote, "It is better that there be objective values." Nozick's view is understandable, could be challenged at least because objectivity mitigates choice. But many other philosophers think the pursuit of objective values is misguided. For example, Isaiah Berlin, Bernard Williams, Sartre, Richard Rorty, John Mackey, postmodernists, and myself. Heidegger speaks of the bizarre effort to prove the objectivity of values, unquote. Yet any investigation of the question of objective value must start with the work of John Mackey. Mackey argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world. I previously discussed this argument, so I won't go over it again in detail here, but it's important to understand what he says and what he means. Mackey gives three main arguments to support his view that there are no objective values. 1. The direction of dependence is mistakenly reversed by making the desire depend upon the goodness. 2. His argument from queerness is that objective values would have an untenable quasi-objective status. And 3. He points to the psychological propensity of the mind to spread itself on external objects, also noted by people like Hume and Freud. Yet in Mackey's argument, the word objective refers to substantive ontological existence, not universality. So here the rejection of objective values doesn't preclude the existence of normative values. Yet Mackey's argument makes it impossible to take universal values off the shelf, as it were. This is because universal or normative values would have to find some other foundation. My strategy is to establish normative values on the structures of consciousness. I will explain what I mean by this shortly. And I agree with Mackey, but on the ground that values can't exist independently without a conscious human agent. Yet there are other problems with the idea of what must be pre-existing objective values. 3 of these problems are as follows. 1. Such pre-existing objective values must be infinite in number to meet infinite human possibilities. One interpretation of this is G.E. Moore's description of Meinong's proliferation of objects as an ontological slum. 2. Not only must they be infinite in number, but they are also required to be infinitely comprehensive in meaning. For example, a principle like do not kill must specify an infinite number of circumstances about who and why they must not kill. And the possibility of unending interpretations rules out the possibility of a definitive principle. And 3, even if such a realm of objective values could be established, why would they be binding on us? That is, how and why should our subjective choices and commitments concur with these objective injunctions? A similar problem of meaning for universal values arises from the very category of ethics itself. That is, there is a real possibility of an invalidating overlap between the categories of ethics and aesthetics. And one difference between ethical and aesthetic values is that aesthetic values can indisputably be created. For example, as a matter of course, we routinely create aesthetic values like I like chocolate ice cream. And this fact can evoke the telling response that aesthetic values can be created, but ethical values can't be created. But this claim implies a clear distinction between moral and aesthetic values. But such a distinction between ethical and aesthetic values is difficult to maintain because, one, the integrity of ethics as a category can be questioned, as I have done so several weeks ago. Two, Nietzsche wanted to replace ethics with an aesthetic justification. And three, categories are themselves determined by human judgments that can be difficult to justify. For example, is cutting down a forest of trees or killing dolphins subject to ethical or aesthetic judgments? Yet another problem for fixed objective values are arguments for ethical relativity. Ethical relativity is often related to cultural relativity, which is thought to indicate ethical relativity. The problem of cultural relativity was recognized by Aristotle. He wrote, "Fire burns in both Hellas and Persia, but men's ideas of right and wrong vary from place to place," unquote. Now, Hellas is the word for ancient Greece. But Aristotle himself demurred on the idea of moral relativity. He based values on cultural and natural conventions and on the principle of moderation. Yet against objectivity, John McDowell and others have noted the uncodifiability of Aristotle's virtue ethics. That is, virtue ethics isn't based on rules, but on the judgment of people who have good character. And Aristotle was alert to the diversity of innumerable situations that cannot all be predicted. This brings us to discuss material circumstances as the first of the three notable preconditions of moral values. The other two are increasing awareness and degrees of consciousness, to be discussed shortly. Many of these arguments that I use here are developmental or evolutionary. This is because we are talking about creating or inventing values as a process of change. Many philosophers, like Hans Jonas, for example, argue that the changing circumstances of modernity need new ethics and values. That is, scientific discoveries produce new circumstances that may require the creation of new values. We can list a number of examples where new ethical values seem to be required. For example, ought we use biogenetics to change the genetic composition and the future nature of the human race? Or to what extent should we artificially extend the lives of comatose patients? Or should data collection be used to subjugate individual privacy for the common good? And the infinite diversity of what physical circumstances can be further argues for the need to create values. As noted earlier, it's preposterous to posit a Platonic realm where all these potential values might reside. That is, that each and every potential value can be accounted for before it is adopted. One response to diversity is to distinguish between formal principles and the material content of particular actions. Both Aristotle and Kant attempted to do this, but in very different ways. Yet no ethical theory has been shown to adequately express the material content of particular actions, and no formal principle of ethics has ever been satisfactorily established. I've argued for these claims elsewhere and in other workshops. Yet related to both potential values and changing circumstances, we can look to the idea of increasing awareness. That is, increasing awareness reveals something that was previously there but wasn't noticed. To explain, I regard awareness as describing a particular area that consciousness focuses on. And this focus will change depending on cognitive rather than physical circumstances. And new values will come swimming into view as we change our perceptions. And we can find examples of where physical circumstances don't change, but perceptions of them do change. For example, the whole area of human and animal rights reveal new values in the same physical circumstances. Concern for ecological values similarly reveals a new awareness of ongoing circumstances. And a new understanding of mind and mental health produces new awareness of new moral issues. For example, the idea of self-deception is quite a modern one that rejects Descartes' transparency of mind. And the idea of self-deception introduces a new ethics, a new existentialist ethics of bad faith and inauthenticity. And awareness brings new possibilities of freedom and personal responsibility. Yet this view might simply imply that a growing awareness is able to perceive pre-existing values. But it's contentious that values can exist before awareness of them, in the absence of a conscious agent. And similarly, some theorists hold that ethical values are produced by their preceding conditions. For example, I frequently argued that religious beliefs have tracked the historical development of ethical values. Most prominently, God is the believer's highest conceivable value, and this highest value has evolved through animism, polytheism, monotheism, and Christianity. Judaic ethics of law, rules, and behaviour gave way to new values in the Christian ethics of intention. Christian ethics gives way to new values with mitigating social and psychological circumstances. Yet these values aren't just waiting in the mind of God, they are produced as needed. Another example of both developing awareness and value is found in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'll just outline them briefly. These are 1. Physiological, 2. Safety, 3. Love and friendship, 4. Respect and social esteem, 5. Self-actualization, becoming oneself and fulfilling potential. This is attained, Maslow holds, by only 2% of humanity. Now, I would argue that these different levels of awareness require different values. Further to such development, I want to consider how graduations of consciousness necessitate the creation of values. Yet the very idea of graduations or degrees of consciousness has been challenged. But I argue for this view elsewhere, and I differentiate it from levels of awareness as above. And I want to emphasize that adult humans typically enjoy similar levels of consciousness. But human development from fetus to adult involves the development of consciousness. The development of both species and individuals necessitates the production of new values. And levels of consciousness in animals, pre-humans, and modern humans also requires new values. I previously argued that animals have values in desires for procreation, nourishment, and pleasure. But animals don't have the required level of reflective consciousness to enjoy moral values. Yet studies like the monkey in the mirror experiment reveal intermediate levels of consciousness. With respect to humans, Jean Piaget and other psychologists argue for graduations of personal development. From birth to 2-year-olds exhibit patterns of exploration. 2 to 7-year-olds use language and symbols but are still egocentric. Yet 7 to 11-year-olds can handle abstract and logical ideas. And 11 to 15-year-olds can employ hypothetical ideas and have a developed theory of mind, meaning appreciating that other people do have self-consciousness. Piaget adds that some of these capacities aren't achieved by many adults, and similar conclusions were reached by George Herbert Mead and Lawrence Kohlberg. These observations indicate that consciousness is graduated in different levels or degrees in both individuals and species, and that different levels of consciousness must entertain different values. And if these are potential or objective values, they must be invented or created. As noted earlier, Kant worked out an interesting position on this issue of created, invented or objective values. Yet the idea of a graduated consciousness was out of the question for Kant. Kant believed in the unity, integrity and the completeness of mind. Yet he worked hard on the appreciation of both the subjective and the objective aspects of moral values. And he adopted reason as an objective capacity that was held by a subjective agent. As another aspect of this subjectivity, Kant made choice one of the key features of his categorical imperative. Although he believed in God, he writes that we must choose to give the moral law to ourselves. We cannot simply accept or be told to act in a moral way, even by God. Like later existentialists, he regarded choice and freedom as preconditions of moral value. Yet Kant establishes both motivation and the material content of his choices through the power of reason. But because reason has a tautologous character, many argue that reason alone cannot establish moral values. Another problem is that Kant holds that the conception of something alone is sufficient for moral motivation. But Hume and others hold that either fact or reason by themselves cannot motivate an action. Philippa Foot, McDowell and McFettridge, for example, regard Kant's categorical imperative as a hypothetical imperative. That is, Kant's moral imperative is only imperative on some prior premise, like a feeling or an impulse. And Kant's cognitivist view of motivation by conception alone poses another problem for his ethics. That is, he thought just conceiving the truth of the moral law was sufficient to evoke duty and motivate action. And without sense or perception, there is no consciousness. A brain in a vat, for example, cannot be conscious. External perceptions are essential. So these are fundamental constraints on choice and value. Then, as Sartre also holds, every perception involves selection and preference, as well as elimination and negation. This is how nascent value is brought into the world with consciousness as at its inception. Value then develops into a driving force evident in every human activity. And then the requirements and satisfactions of value in morals, meaning and purpose evoke a question for everyone. That is, consciously or unconsciously, how can I maintain or further my value? And in my view, it's this fundamental motive that is expressed in normative values. Not that it is always expressed, but eventually becomes inescapable. And this must also eventually take the form of a choice for value as an affirmation of value, as the will to value. I argue that this is a self-validating principle, the negation of which is self-contradictory and self-defeating. But we still need to determine the detailed material content of behaviour. The material content of action of this principle is given by the pursuit of value in needing to act well in order to accrue value. Conversely, acting badly on the agent's own judgment diminishes the agent's value. Yet there is a dependence here on the agent's judgment, making this system fallibilist. Fallibilism is nevertheless a strength which accommodates human error and rejects Kantian absolutes. Yet such a system of values tends to eliminate error as incompatible with the agent's values. On this view, we choose to affirm or deny the formal principle of value as the will to value. Yet we create or invent values for the material content of action that express this principle. On this view, we choose the formal content and create or invent the material content of moral action. The same solution can be applied to the question of meaning and purpose in life. The much laboured statement is often made that there is no meaning in the world or even in life. I would say, of course not. The question is, how can we invest our lives with meaning and purpose? We should then consider the foundations of meaning coming from within the realm of value. And we then need to consider the kind of actions that would best lead to meaning. In these ways, we have discussed both the possibility and need of creating or inventing new values. But we haven't said much about an issue that interests me more, that is, what these new values might be. Yet as suggested, all values might well be new values in their own time or era. For Kant, these included uninhibited choice. For existentialists, we have authenticity, if not freedom and responsibility. For Nietzsche, we have the elevation of aesthetic values and the will to power. Further iterations can also be made between Nietzsche's notion of the will to power and the will to will. The will to will is the iteration preferred by Heidegger, further interpretable as a will to value. This interpretation is indeed appropriate because Nietzsche emphasized, and without sense or perception there is no consciousness. A brain in a vat, for example, cannot be conscious. External perceptions are essential. So these are fundamental constraints on choice and value. Then, as Sartre also holds, every perception involves selection and preference, as well as elimination and negation. This is how nascent value is brought into the world with consciousness as at its inception. Value then develops into a driving force evident in every human activity. And then the requirements and satisfactions of value in morals, meaning and purpose evoke a question for everyone. That is, consciously or unconsciously, how can I maintain or further my value? And in my view, it's this fundamental motive that is expressed in normative values. Not that it is always expressed, but eventually becomes inescapable. And this must also eventually take the form of a choice for value as an affirmation of value, as the will to value. I argue that this is a self-validating principle, the negation of which is self-contradictory and self-defeating. But we still need to determine the detailed material content of behaviour. The material content of action of this principle is given by the pursuit of value in needing to act well in order to accrue value. Conversely, acting badly on the agent's own judgment diminishes the agent's value. Yet there is a dependence here on the agent's judgment, making this system fallibilist. Fallibilism is nevertheless a strength which accommodates human error and rejects Kantian absolutes. Yet such a system of values tends to eliminate error as incompatible with the agent's values. On this view, we choose to affirm or deny the formal principle of value as the will to value. Yet we create or invent values for the material content of action that express this principle. On this view, we choose the formal content and create or invent the material content of moral action. The same solution can be applied to the question of meaning and purpose in life. The much laboured statement is often made that there is no meaning in the world or even in life. I would say, of course not. The question is, how can we invest our lives with meaning and purpose? We should then consider the foundations of meaning coming from within the realm of value. And we then need to consider the kind of actions that would best lead to meaning. In these ways, we have discussed both the possibility and need of creating or inventing new values. But we haven't said much about an issue that interests me more, that is, what these new values might be. Yet as suggested, all values might well be new values in their own time or era. For Kant, these included uninhibited choice. For existentialists, we have authenticity, if not freedom and responsibility. For Nietzsche, we have the elevation of aesthetic values and the will to power. Further iterations can also be made between Nietzsche's notion of the will to power and the will to will. The will to will is the iteration preferred by Heidegger, further interpretable as a will to value. This interpretation is appropriate given Nietzsche's emphasis on value as a central concern. Yet the will to value is, of course, my preferred principle, leading to a sufficiency of value. And I've qualified value sufficiency with criteria such as quality, absence, and coherence. And I would want to present these criteria as creations or inventions of new values. But the objection might be made that if value is inherent to consciousness, then we don't need to affirm it. The will to value may be present in all conscious creatures, but it needs to be formulated and affirmed. The need for affirmation arises from two features of reflective consciousness. Like value, it's a fragile entity that requires affirmation and reinforcement. And as a reflective entity, it can and has need to exercise the capacity of affirmation. My conclusion is that we must choose the formal content and create or invent the material content of value. That is, we create the material content of moral action and value from the possibilities offered to us in life. And the same paradigm can be applied to wider questions such as meaning and purpose. To do this, I presented the view that values and moral values are not objective or have a fixed material content, and that the dividing line between moral, aesthetic and other values is fluid and not definitive, and that there are different kinds of preconditions which call for new values. These were material circumstances, increasing awareness and degrees of consciousness, and in addition variable circumstances in cultural and ethical relativity, and individual species development all show a need to create or invent new values as ethical principles. Yet I have suggested a commonality of all conscious beings in that they all produce and experience value, and the affirmation of value works as a source of satisfaction, a principle of ethics of meaning and purpose. And finally, the value of value as the will to value is the new value that we have needed to create. Although value, values, and the will to value already exist as part of conscious experience, it is a created value because it is a new process that we need to formulate and affirm. Yet I also want to eventually consider the kind of values required for new forms of morality and understanding. And on the lines proposed, such new values can be found in the foundation in the structures of consciousness. So let me have your criticism and comments at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.